ad section, here is Not Our War, Keep Us Out. Saturday the 22nd, this coming Saturday, 12 p.m. Trafalgar Square. Encourage everybody to go to that. Now, unfortunately, for various reasons, Patrick is no longer able to attend that, so Patrick Henderson will not be speaking at that event, but everybody should go to that anyway. And then finally, just a reminder, referendum on ending the government's economically costly Ukraine-Russia policies. This has only had 4,500 signatures so far. Everybody should be signing. I know we don't like petitions necessarily, but everybody should be signing this because at the very least it makes views known.
Yeah.
Right, where does that take us? Oh yes, a quick correction. I do apologize to everybody. My video of from the Sudan segment on Monday's program included some footage which was not genuine. So I just wanted to make the point though that the Sudanese paramilitary group, the Rapid Support Forces, had claimed to be shooting down helicopters, but yeah, the video was incorrect. So I do apologize for that. But I'll just make this point. Yesterday, James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, was at the G7 Foreign Ministers meeting with Anthony Blinken. And of course, they're condemning what's going on in Sudan at the moment, despite the fact that, well, many questions need to be asked about how much Conflict Stability and Security Fund money has contributed to the situation there at the moment. But Blinken pushed this out on Twitter yesterday, saying, in today's G7 sessions, we discussed the risk of unsustainable debt in Africa, Wagner's nefarious influence in Africa, and the importance of supporting partners in reaching sustained peace. We agreed that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought, is how he ended the tweet. But on Monday's program, I was certainly asking the question, did this situation in Sudan kick off because the Sudanese government had decided to permit the Russian naval fleet to be based in Sudan port? And certainly Blinken gives us a hint there because they are clearly extremely concerned about Wagner Group and their activities in that part of the world.
Yeah, and of course we reported many years ago on the fact that Africa was going to increasingly become an interest for the European Union and its power base. And of course, the Americans are going to be in there because they wouldn't want anybody else to be in there first. Well, let's have a look at what's happening in Ukraine. And I have a section of video here. I do not know who has produced this video. If anybody watching recognises it and can let me know, then we will give full credit to the individual that's produced it. However, it does provide a very easy to understand time clip of how the Russians approach their battle for Bakhmut. And let's play it. And it has got a narration to it, so you can listen in at the same time. But for anybody who thinks that the fighting out in Ukraine has sort of stagnated and those Russians don't know what they're doing, just have a look at this little clip.
With Bakhmut consisting of many buildings, the only way to take it was to encircle it and cut the supply lines to the city. But this was easier said than done because the city itself was surrounded by considerable urban terrain. The way west of the city was blocked off by the town of Chasiv Yar and the village of Ivanyivska. To the northeast of Bakhmut, the urban area extended through Krasna Hora and Soledar towards Bakhmutska and Yakovlevka. So in order to encircle Bakhmut, the Russians would have to overcome good defensive terrain. The Russian offensive began in mid-December. We will first look at the attack from the south. During the first 4 weeks of the offensive from mid-December to mid-January, the Russian progress here was slow. During late January and early February, they advanced up to Ivanyivska, then their attack was completely stopped by the Ukrainian forces. The progress of this attack was underwhelming, but it still had distracted the Ukrainian forces long enough that the Russians had been able to make large progress with their northern attack. This is how it went. During the third week of December, the Russians took the Ukrainian strongpoint of Yakovlevka. During the last part of the month, they expanded their positions and also assaulted Bakhmutska, which fell to them during the first week of January. Then the Russians approached the town of Soledar from two sides. During the second week of January, they captured the eastern part of the town, and during the third week, they took the rest of it. By that time, they had reached the Bakhmutka river. Now, their last obstacle was the urban area of Krasna Hora. In the last part of January, the Russians crossed the Bakhmutka river near Soledar and occupied the heights overlooking Krasna Hora. During the first week of February, they moved out to outflank the Krasna Hora position, and by the third week of the month had captured it. This made the Ukrainians retreat from the eastern part of Bakhmut to shorten their defensive line. Then the Russians seemed to advance west in an attempt to cut off the Ukrainian supply lines into Bakhmut. During the rest of February, they made these gains. During the first week of March, they advanced some more. But it seems like then their focus was changed to attacking Bakhmut directly. During the second week of March, they gained this territory, and this is what the front line looks like at the end of the fourth week of March, around the time of this video being finished.
So a very clear little video there, which really gives you some idea of the scale of the fighting on both sides, but also the Russians' approach to what they're doing. So the West's comments that Russia is incompetent on the battlefield, they're fighting with spades, they don't know what they're doing. Clearly, this was very well thought out approach on the battlefield. But where does it take us? It takes us to the fact that the Russians at the moment are still very happy that the Ukrainians are throwing more and more resources into the remnants of the occupied territory inside Bakhmut. And if we can bring this slide up on screen, where we can see here a mass of Ukrainian military flags or markers showing the units in the last part of the city. Reports now are pretty unified on saying that the Ukrainians have brought about 100,000 troops into the Bakhmut conflict. That doesn't mean to say they've all been brought into the city. They've been brought into the city and surrounding areas to form a second line of defense, but with no air cover, no missile systems, anti-air missile systems left of their own. The Ukrainian troops are now vulnerable to Russian air attack, and the Russians are using some very large-scale airdrop bombs, which means that the slaughter is now increasing. If we just bring in this inset map here, this actually shows the remaining portion for Ukraine. That's in the yellowy-green colour on the left. And essentially, Ukraine holds about 10% of the city, with a remaining 8%, which is still no man's land in the west. But the fighting still goes on at a time when all nations, we believe, should be calling for a ceasefire to stop the slaughter and the carnage. And if we go to the other fortified town, this is Avdiivka. This is the second most important stronghold after Bakhmut, and it's the area from which the Ukrainians have consistently shelled Donetsk and civilian targets. Well, this is also surrounded by the Russians, if we just bring in some markers to show what's actually going on here. But of course, the other thing, as this horrible battle continues, so does the Ukrainian shelling of largely civilian areas inside the Russian-controlled territory. And over the weekend, which was the Orthodox Easter weekend, for whatever reason, Ukraine was shelling, rocketing churches as well as other civilian infrastructure. So truly horrible. And the casualties that it would appear that the Ukrainians are now prepared to admit to the Americans are 257,000. And that would mean, if it's correct, many think it's still an underestimate, that there's going to be at least five times that number of wounded men. So men with severe injuries for life or minor wounds. We're getting close to 1 million. So this is the devastation of Ukraine. And of course, it can only have happened with the full connivance and support of the West and the arms that the US, UK, NATO and the European Union are pouring in. Meanwhile, let's have a look at how the BBC is approaching life. And I've said this many times, so I laugh at myself. Each time I think the BBC has done it, they come up with something better. So here's the headline: Ukraine war, the Russian ships accused of North Sea sabotage. But the headline is, this is the Ukraine war. So what's really going on here? This is an attack on the public mind. This is BBC disinformation. I'm calling it fear porn because it's all about fear. And this is a remarkable piece of reporting.
Just before we move on, Brian, I just want to take that off screen again for a second. Is that supposed to be an oil platform? What is that sitting in the middle of all those turbines?
Possibly. The scale's a bit deceptive with the picture, but possibly it's an oil platform, or possibly it's a control platform for the turbines themselves. Right. I wasn't able to. I did notice that strange little object, but I wasn't able to get to the bottom of it. So we'll do a bit more work on that. But here's the story, headlined: Ukraine war, the Russian ships accused of North Sea sabotage. And let's bring in one of the ships. The photo the BBC used is early morning or dusk. It's a little bit sinister. The pirate ship's got the lights on. And here it is. The report focuses on a Russian vessel called the Admiral Vladimirsky. And what has this vessel been doing? Well, apparently it's been sneaking around the North Sea, having a look at all the windmills. And this has got the BBC very, very excited. They've teamed up with other news teams.
Just to clarify, we're talking about offshore wind turbines here?
Yes, yes, indeed, yeah. So the BBC's teamed up with media outlets in other countries: Denmark, Norway, Sweden. Also, Holland is quoted in the article. Apparently, somebody in a rubber boat, a reporter, approached the ship, and the BBC is shocked that when they did this, the boat was confronted by an armed individual on board the Russian ship. So I would say to that, I'm absolutely not surprised, because the same thing's likely to happen with a British or American unit. And let's put in the title from the whole saga here. This is the BBC. This is now Putin's shadow war. So it's all very sinister stuff. This is the journalist, Gordon Carrera. And let's have a look at what he said in the article. A Danish counterintelligence officer says the sabotage plans are being prepared in case of a full conflict with the West. Well, the head of Norwegian intelligence told the broadcasters, that's the group, the program was considered highly important for Russia and was controlled directly from Moscow. Do you get the passion in there?
Yes, but told the broadcasters, that's the group. So this is the rapid response mechanism at work. We decide what our narrative is. It becomes a common narrative across all broadcasters in the G7, and away we go. Away we go.
Thank you for that, Mike. So let's pop in this, because I can say with confidence here that both NATO, the US, NATO, UK and Russia have had sabotage plans in place during the Cold War. And since those days, Gordon Carrera, there is nothing new here. So this is just regurgitating something for to spin a line. The broadcasters say they've analysed intercepted Russian communications, which indicate so-called ghost ships sailing in Nordic waters, which have turned off the transmitters so as not to reveal their locations. This could have been written from the mind of a 14-year-old who wanted to do a little bit of a spooky spy story, but it's nonsense. Are we really saying that broadcasters have analysed Russian communications? Were the military and intel services not capable of this? Or I'm going to suggest it's more likely that BBC monitoring, which is an arm of British intelligence, would have been at work here. So this is a beautifully spun story. Let's carry on through. The report focuses on the Russian vessel called Admiral Vladimirsky. Officially, this is an expeditionary oceanographic ship or underwater research vessel, but the report alleges that it is in fact a Russian spy ship. Again, there's nothing new here. This is Cold War routine, which has continued since the Cold War. Any vessel getting near the coast of Russia would be used by the Americans and the British to spy. That's the nature of the game. Here we are. The documentary uses an anonymous former UK Royal Navy expert to track the movements of the vessel in the vicinity of 7 wind farms off the coast of the UK and the Netherlands on one mission. And if we put a bit of comment in this, I'm fascinated as to why the UK Royal Navy expert would need to be anonymous. I would say stand up and be counted. But of course, by saying it's anonymous, the BBC can up the spookery and the sinister nature of what's happening. So he said, we saw in recent months Russian actors try to uncover how the energy system works in the North Sea. It's the first time we've seen this. So Gordon Carrera putting there the quote from General Jan Swillens, the head of Dutch military intelligence. And I find it incredible that the BBC thinks the Russians have watched this whole infrastructure built, but they've only taken until now to come and work out what's in place and how it works. This is nonsense by the BBC. And he then says this: reconnaissance of sensitive sites is not unusual, and Western countries will likely be carrying out similar activity against Russia. The intention is likely to have a series of options available should a conflict escalate. Apologies, got a little bit of editing text in there. But now he has admitted that this is normal. So he puts a headline of Ukraine. He's getting people to think of the war in Ukraine. He's talking about Russian sabotage. He calls it Putin's shadow war. And then 2/3 of the way through the article, he tells you it's all normal. This is outrageous. And there can only be one agenda here, which is to increase fear, alarm, and distress in the public mind. But you get another clue as to what this man's really about, because if you go to his Twitter page, his header is Russians Among Us, sleeper cells, ghost stories, and the hunt for Putin spies. And he's selling his book. So is this factual reporting by the BBC, or is this hype to sell a book? I just think this is utterly disgraceful by the BBC, and they should be held to full account by the whole population of UK. Disgraceful stuff.
Did he mention that our early warning radar on the East Coast doesn't work because of all these wind farms?
No, he didn't actually. He didn't.
Okay. Well, look, apologies. We had one more little ad that we didn't put in the ad section, so let's bring it on screen now, because apologies to David for this, but Scottish Vaccine Injury Group Unite rally taking place on Saturday at 1 p.m, Buchanan Gallery steps, with a number of guest speakers, including Dr. Kat Lindley, Mark Sharman, Dr. Asim Malhotra, and so on. So do get along to that if you're in Glasgow.